She brought her own tools. That was the thing that stopped the room. Jorie Baxter walked through the side door of the Iron Pines Motorcycle Club garage on a Tuesday evening in early November with a tool bag over one shoulder and rain running down the back of her collar. And the first man to see her was Nate McKenzie, who was sorting bolts at a side bench and who had, over 22 years of club membership, developed the particular reflex of noticing things that didn't belong in a space. She didn't belong in this space, not obviously. She was 24 years old and lean in the way people get lean when they've been working hard and eating second, with short dark hair that was wet at the ends, and a canvas jacket that had seen better decades. The tool bag was real, a proper mechanic's roll, worn at the handles in a way that meant it had been used, not carried around for show. Nate set down his bolts. "Help you?" he said. She looked past him at the bikes on the lifts, at the oil-stained concrete floor, at the fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and made everything look a little harder than it was. "I heard you've got a panhead that nobody can sort out," she said. Her voice was steady, not aggressive, not apologetic, just even the way voices sound when someone is used to walking into rooms where they're not expected. "I'm a mechanic. I've been doing this since I was 16. If you'll let me look at the bike, I'll tell you in 10 minutes what's wrong with it. No charge for the diagnosis." Nate looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his head toward the back of the garage and said one word. "Stone." Calvin Meade had been president of the Iron Pines MC for 19 years, and in that time he had been surprised. Genuinely surprised, perhaps 8 times. He was a big man with gray threading through his beard and forearms that told the story of a life lived in physical work, and he moved across the garage floor the way a person moves when they've learned not to hurry, deliberately, taking in everything as he went. He stopped about 2 meters from Jorie Baxter and looked at her the way he looked at everything he hadn't decided what to think of yet, quietly from the outside in. He took in the tool bag, the wet jacket, the way she was standing, feet planted, shoulders back, not braced for rejection but not expecting welcome either. He noticed, without making a show of noticing it, that she was favoring her right hand slightly, holding it a little loose at her side in a way that wasn't quite natural. "Which panhead?" he said. "The 63. Two-tone red and cream. It's been sitting in your corner bay since September." He hadn't said a word to anyone outside the club about that bike. "You know about it how?" "Wes Okafor mentioned it. He knows my father." Calvin knew Wes Okafor. He'd been bringing a road bike to the garage for 11 years. That wasn't nothing. "Your father?" "Gerald Baxter. He ran Baxter's garage on Collier Street for 30 years. She paused. "He had a stroke 8 months ago. I've been running the shop since." Something shifted in the room, though nothing moved. The 2 men closest to the far wall hadn't looked up from what they were doing, but they had. Calvin could feel it. "You got a name," he said. Jorie Baxter." "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The 63's out back. Phil, show her to it." Phil Covell, who the club called Brack on account of an incident in Thunder Bay that he had told the story of exactly once, led her to the corner bay without much conversation. He crossed his arms and watched her crouch beside the old panhead and run her hands over the engine the way a doctor runs hands over something they're reading, rather than touching. It took her 9 minutes, not 10. She stood up and turned to Phil and said, "The primary chain case gasket is gone. That's the obvious one. But the real problem is the timing advance mechanism. It's gummed up, which means it's been running with incorrect ignition timing under load. Whoever wrote it last pushed it too hard without the engine being properly warmed, probably more than once. You've also got a slow seep on the left fork seal that's been there long enough to leave a track mark down the lower leg. That one's minor, but it'll get worse." Phil stared at her. "You want me to write that down?" she said. He went to get Calvin. Calvin listened to the diagnosis without interrupting, which was how he listened to most things he considered worth hearing. When Jorie finished, he asked her 2 questions: how long the repair would take and what parts she'd need. She answered both without hesitation, with specific numbers, and when she referenced the parts list she'd apparently already built in her head, she looked slightly to the left of him the way people look when they're reading something off the inside of their own memory. He told her to come back Thursday with the parts, and she could do the work. She came back Thursday. She brought the parts. She finished the panhead in 4 hours, documented every step on a folded piece of paper she left on the seat with her invoice, and packed up her tools and left before anyone had thought to ask her anything else. On Friday morning, Tommy Foss started the panhead. It ran the way it was supposed to run. Tommy rode it around the block twice, came back and went directly to Calvin's office. "She's good," he said, which from Tommy was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Calvin nodded. "Call her. Tell her we've got 3 more bikes that need sorting." The second week and then the third, and by the fourth week Jorie Baxter was at the Iron Pines garage, 3 days out of 7. She worked on bikes and charged fairly and never said more than necessary and always left the workspace cleaner than she found it. The club members who had been skeptical, and there had been 2 or 3, had stopped being skeptical. Not because anyone said anything about it, but because she'd fixed a seized rear brake on Brack's personal bike in 30 minutes on a Wednesday morning, and he had said simply good and gone back to his coffee, which was Brack's way of saying he'd changed his mind permanently. Calvin watched her the way he watched everyone new to a space he was responsible for. He noticed that she arrived early and worked past when she said she would. He noticed she tracked the club's parts inventory without being asked and had twice pointed out discrepancies that saved them real money. He noticed the hand, the right one she'd been favoring, was healing whatever it was. He could see the faint yellowing of a bruise that had been significant not long ago. He didn't ask, not yet. What changed things was the truck. It was a Tuesday morning of Jorie's 5th week, and Nate McKenzie had gone outside to move a bike from the side lot when he came back in with a look on his face that Calvin had learned over 2 decades to read precisely. Not alarm, not anger. The specific expression of someone who had seen something they weren't sure what to do with. Black pickup, Nate said quietly, sitting at the end of the block. Been there since at least 8. Calvin didn't react visibly. He looked across the garage to where Jorie was bent over a carburetor rebuild at the center bench. He watched her. Then he not bothered to hide it. Then he watched her again, the moment she noticed him looking, in the half-second before that, when she'd already clocked the truck on the street through the open bay door and decided not to say anything. She knew the truck. He waited until lunch, when the garage quieted down and Brack had gone for food and Tommy was on a call. He poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them both to the center bench and set one in front of Jorie without asking if she wanted it. He sat down on a stool and he held his own cup and looked at her. Tell me about the truck, he said. She didn't play dumb. He'd expected that. She wasn't the kind of person who wasted energy on pretense. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. Then she said, it belongs to a man named Lawrence Devereaux. He's a property developer out of Sudbury. He's been trying to buy our garage for 2 years. Baxter's. It's on Collier and 2nd, corner lot. He wants to put up a mixed-use complex, condos and retail. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. My dad said no 3 times by letter, twice in person. And after your dad's stroke. He made his first offer to me 6 days after my father was admitted to hospital. The garage was very quiet. Outside, the November wind pushed against the bay door. You think the stroke wasn't natural, Calvin said. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was level in the specific way that voices level out when someone has rehearsed a thought so many times that the emotion has been separated from the words. My father was 58 years old and in good health, she said. He was found unconscious in the shop on a Monday morning. The official cause was hypertensive stroke. He'd had no prior history. She paused. The week before, Devereaux sent a man to the garage, not a lawyer, not an assistant. A man named Reg Vickers, who handles things for Devereaux that don't get written on letterhead. My dad called me that night. He said the man had looked at the building more than he'd looked at my dad. He said it felt like being measured for something. She stopped. 2 days later, my dad had his stroke. Calvin absorbed this. He drank his coffee. He looked at the wall. That's a serious thing to believe, he said. I know it is, she said, which is why I haven't said it to anyone, except you just now for the first time. He looked at her. Why me? She held his gaze. 'Cause you're the first person who's asked the right question. That evening, after Jorie had packed up and left, Calvin held a table meeting. It was short, and it covered what needed covering. Nate said the black truck had come back twice over the following week. Brack, whose practical mind Calvin relied on for the moments when his own inclination toward action outpaced strategy, said the obvious thing. We don't know what Devereaux actually did. What we know is that a young woman is working here, and someone is watching her. She's working here, Calvin said, which means she's here. Brack picked up his glass. I know. That was the end of the disagreement, because when Calvin said something that way, and Brack acknowledged it that way, a decision had been made. The table understood. It was Tommy Foss who found it, on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of November. He'd been pulling old intake forms from the back office to make space. The club kept records going back 15 years, physical copies in an unhappy filing system that no one had touched since the previous office manager had moved to BC. And he came across an intake form from 3 years ago, rubber-banded to a small envelope of photos. He brought them to Calvin without saying what they were. He just set them on the desk and waited. Calvin looked at the intake form first. It was for a black Ford F-350 late model, brought in for bodywork and a front-end assessment. The date on the form was 3 years and 4 months ago. The client name was listed as a numbered company, which wasn't unusual in itself, but the vehicle description matched. make, model, approximate year. The truck that had been parked at the end of the block for the past 2 weeks. Then Calvin looked at the photos. The envelope contained 6 of them, printed on regular paper, stapled to a secondary form that was the shop's internal damage assessment record. The truck had sustained significant impact damage to the front right quarter panel, the kind of damage you got from hitting something or someone at moderate speed. The notes on the assessment form described the damage as consistent with a low-speed collision with a fixed object. Calvin looked at the photos for a long time. Then he thought about Jorie Baxter, 58 years old, found unconscious on a Monday morning in his garage on Collier Street. He thought about what a person found like that in the early morning in a one-man shop might have looked like if, before they were found, something had struck them at low speed in a poorly lit space, and if whoever had done it had been careful about what they left behind. He thought about a numbered company. He thought about Reg Vickers. He set the photos down very carefully and looked at Tommy. "Who worked on this truck?" he said. Tommy had already checked, Real, but he moved to Timmins 2 years ago. And a part-timer that summer, guy named Brennan. He left the same season. "Find Real," Calvin said. He didn't tell Jorie that night, not while there was nothing solid enough to hand her that wouldn't simply add weight without giving her anything to stand on. What he did instead was make 3 phone calls. The first was to a woman named Diane Paquette, who worked as a paralegal at a civil law firm in Sudbury and who had done careful, quiet work for the club twice before. She was the kind of person who understood the difference between what you wanted to happen and what could actually be made to happen, and she communicated that difference without being discouraging. Calvin told her what he had: a damaged vehicle record, a numbered company, and a circumstantial timeline that connected Devereaux's push on the Baxter property to a stroke that may not have been natural. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said that intake form is significant if the vehicle can be traced to Devereaux or Vickers through the numbered company. Give me 2 days. The second call was to a man named Ron Stelzer, a retired RCMP officer who had spent 12 years in financial crimes and who had over those years developed an informed opinion about Lawrence Devereaux that he had never been in a position to act on. Calvin knew Ron the way he knew certain people, not closely but solidly, through a shared understanding that occasionally made their paths cross in productive directions. Ron picked up on the second ring. Calvin told him what was happening, and Ron said, after a pause, "I know who Vickers is. The numbered company is one of 6 shells Devereaux uses for anything he doesn't want attached to his name. If the truck was brought in under that company, I can tell you who registered it." "How long?" "Give me tomorrow morning." The third call was the hardest. Calvin made it sitting at his desk with the photos in front of him and the lights low, and the person he called was Jorie Baxter. He told her to come in early the next day. He told her he had found something. He told her not to panic, which was a useless instruction but felt necessary. She was there at 7:15. He hadn't told her what kind of something, and she hadn't asked. She walked in carrying her coffee and her tool bag, the same as every other morning, and she sat across from him in the one chair that wasn't covered in parts catalogs, and she looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had, in the 5 weeks he'd known her, communicated more than most people managed with sentences. He set the photos on the desk between them. She looked at them. She looked at the intake form. She looked at the date. Her hands were flat on the desk surface. She didn't pick anything up. She read the damage notes on the assessment form, and then she sat very still for a moment, and something happened behind her eyes that Calvin recognized. The particular expression of a thing you believed in the body, suddenly arriving in the mind. "That's the truck," she said, not a question. "We believe so. The numbered company. Diane is tracing it this morning. Ron Stelzer, he's a retired officer, believes it connects to Devereaux through a known shell structure." Jorie looked at the photo of the front right quarter panel. She looked at it for a long time. "My dad described the man who came to the shop," she said. "Reg Vickers. He said the man walked around the building twice while they were talking. He looked at the parking access on the north side. He said the man smiled the whole time, which is the detail that bothered my dad most. Not the look on his face, but that it never changed." She pressed her lips together briefly. "The north access is where my dad parks his truck. If you came in early enough, before he opened, the sight lines from the street don't cover that corner." Calvin was very still. "I have a notebook," Jorie said. 2, actually. I started keeping records the week after Devereaux's first offer. Dates, conversations, anything that seemed off. She stopped. "I didn't know what I was building. I just knew I needed somewhere to put what I was seeing." He looked at her. "Those notebooks, Jorie." "I know," she said. "I brought them." She reached into her jacket pocket and set 2 small notebooks on the desk beside the photos. "I carry them everywhere. I wasn't going to leave them at the shop." Calvin looked at the notebooks. He looked at her. And for a moment he understood exactly who Jorie Baxter's daughter was. Not because of the notebooks, but because of the instinct that had made her keep them. The instinct of a person who has spent long enough paying attention to the wrong things being done quietly that they've learned to document the world around them before they know why. We're going to do this right, he said. Diane, Ron, whatever attorney she brings in. Legal channels, documented, no shortcuts. Jorie looked at him steadily. Devereaux has reach in this city. He sits on 2 infrastructure boards. He's put his name on half the new development permits in the last decade. I know, Calvin said, which is exactly why we don't go around it. We go through it with everything solid behind us. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why are you doing this? He thought about several things he could say and said the true one. Because your father built something honest and someone tried to take it from him by putting him in a hospital bed. And because that's in my garage now, those photos, which means it's no longer a problem you're carrying alone. She looked at the desk, then she looked at him, and something in her face, some particular bracing that had been there since the first night she walked through the door, eased, fractionally, in the way things ease when a person realizes they don't have to keep holding the same weight at the same height without stopping. Okay, she said quietly. She picked up her coffee. She picked up her tool bag. There's a 49 knucklehead in the end bay that's been ignored since Wednesday. I want to start on the car before the others get in. He watched her go. He reached for his phone and called Diane. The next 48 hours were the kind that look slow from the outside and feel like running from the inside. Diane traced the numbered company in a day and a half. It was registered to a holding corporation with 2 directors, one of them an accountant whose name appeared on 6 other Dever-linked entities, and the other a man named Reginald Vickers, listed with a Sudbury address. The truck brought to the Iron Pines garage for repairs 3 years ago had been registered under that same numbered company 11 days before the date on the intake form, then re-registered under a different shell company 4 months later. Someone had been careful. They had not been careful enough. Ron Stelzer called Calvin with 2 additional pieces. The first was a municipal planning application that Devereaux had filed for the Collier Street corner lot, Baxter's garage, 14 months before Gerald Baxter's stroke. The application had been submitted in confidence and had never appeared on any public agenda. It referenced the property as prospectively available pending ownership transfer. Gerald Baxter had not agreed to any transfer at that point. He had not agreed to any transfer at any point. Someone had filed for a permit on a property they did not own and did not have agreement to purchase, more than a year before the owner ended up in hospital. Calvin read the document twice. Then he called Diane back and told her to bring in whoever she trusted most for civil litigation. The attorney Diane brought in was a woman named Claire Weston, who ran a small firm in Sudbury that handled civil rights and municipal accountability cases, and who had a particular familiarity with Lawrence Devereaux from a zoning dispute 5 years earlier that had not ended in charges, but had ended in Devereaux quietly withdrawing a project that had looked to certain observers like it had been built on a foundation of favors. Claire had never forgotten that file. She met Jorie and Calvin together in Diane's office on a Wednesday morning, and she shook Jorie's hand and looked at the 2 notebooks and the intake photos, and the planning application and the traced corporate documents, and she said, I want to be honest with you. What you have here is significant. I also want to tell you that Devereaux will fight this, and he will not fight it gently. I understand that, Jorie said. He'll try to make you look unstable. He may contact your father's doctors. He may go after the business. He's already been trying to take the business for 2 years. That's not new. Claire looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Diane with an expression that said she understood exactly who she was dealing with. She walked them through the path forward. A formal complaint to the Ontario Securities Commission regarding the shell company's structure, a civil action connected to the planning application fraud, and, contingent on what could be established about the vehicle, a referral to the OPP's Major Crimes Unit on the question of what had happened to Gerald Baxter 8 months ago in his garage on Collier Street. The planning document alone is damaging, Claire said. Filing a development application on a property with no agreement from the owner, under an assumption of pending ownership transfer, that's actionable. Combined with the corporate trail and the vehicle record, you have a pattern. She paused. Patterns are harder to dismiss than incidents. 2 days later, Devereaux sent people to the Iron Pines garage. Not lawyers. A property manager and 2 men with clipboards, who appeared at the bay door at 9 in the morning, identified themselves as representatives of Devereaux Development, and asked to speak with the property's registered owner about a parking encroachment. There was no parking encroachment. It was a pretext to assess what was happening, and everyone present understood that. Nate walked them to Calvin's office. Calvin looked at the 3 of them and said, pleasantly, that any legitimate concerns about property boundaries could be addressed in writing, through their attorneys, and that the addresses for both the club's lawyer and the civil firm handling a related matter were available on request. He said this was now the only channel available to them. The property manager started to say something else. Calvin looked at him. The property manager stopped. They left within 15 minutes. What broke it open, and what none of them had seen coming, was a phone call on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Claire had filed the civil complaint. It came to Diane's office, not to the club. The caller identified herself as Gloria Hartman. She was 61 years old, had lived on Collier Street for 20 years, and had moved away from the neighborhood 14 months ago. She had read about the civil complaint online, and she had been thinking about calling since she read it. She had been walking her dog at 6:15 in the morning, 3 years ago, on the Monday that Jorie Baxter was found in his shop. She had seen a black pickup truck parked on the north side of the Baxter's garage property. She had seen a man let himself through the side gate at the north access, the door, she noted carefully, that was usually kept locked. The man had been inside for approximately 8 minutes. When he came out, he walked directly to the truck and drove away. She had not thought much of it at the time, assuming it was someone with legitimate access. She had, however, noted the license plate on her phone, the way she noted anything unusual near a neighbor's property, because that was the habit of a person who paid attention to her street. The plate traced to a vehicle registered under a numbered company with a Sudbury address, the same numbered company. Gloria gave her statement to Claire Weston by video call on a Friday morning, and what she described was specific and consistent with everything that had come before it. She had not moved away from Collier Street randomly. She had received a visit from a man who suggested, in the careful language of someone who had done this before, that the neighborhood might not suit her long-term plans. She had left. She had spent 14 months angry about leaving. Reading the complaint had made her stop being angry and start being useful. Devereaux's response to the filing, when it came, was swift and leveraged everything a man with resources could leverage. His attorneys contacted the OPP directly, framing the complaint as harassment. A story appeared in a Sudbury newspaper suggesting that a motorcycle club had mounted a campaign against a local developer for commercial reasons. The article did not name Jorie Baxter. It did not need to. Claire had anticipated all of it. She had filed everything in a way that was watertight, and what Devereaux's attorneys found when they tried to reduce the scope was that the scope had been built specifically to resist reduction. The planning application was a matter of public record the moment it was filed as part of the complaint. The corporate documents had been submitted to the OSC. Ron Stelzer had agreed to provide a formal statement about Devereaux's known shell structures based on his years in financial crimes, and while he'd never been positioned to act on what he knew before, he was very ready to say it now. And Gloria Hartman had a license plate. The OPP Major Crimes Unit assigned an investigator to the question of Gerald Baxter's stroke on a Wednesday in December, 6 weeks after Claire had made the referral. The investigator's name was Sandra Falk, and she was meticulous in the way that people are meticulous when they've been given a file that others doubted and want to be certain of what they've actually got. She met with Jorie for 3 hours. Jorie gave her the notebooks, both of them, every entry. Sandra Falk read the first 30 pages in the room while Jorie sat and drank her coffee, and at one point Sandra looked up and said, "How long have you been keeping records?" "Since his first offer," Jorie said. 23 months. Sandra looked at the notebook. "You dated every entry." "I timed most of them." Sandra did not say what she was thinking, but her pen started moving faster, and it didn't stop for the remainder of the session. The morning the formal charges were filed against Lawrence Devereaux and Reginald Vickers. It was a Tuesday in late January. The charges were serious: criminal negligence causing bodily harm, fraud related to the planning application, and 1 count of obstruction connected to Gloria Hartman's departure from Collier Street. Vickers was named as a co-accused on 2 of the 3. Diane called Calvin at 8:20 in the morning. Calvin went to the center bay where Jorie was reassembling a transmission on an early 70s shovelhead, and he crouched beside the bench and said, simply, "They filed." Jorie set down the part in her hands. She didn't move for a moment. "What are the charges?" she said. He told her. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then she said, "Criminal negligence causing bodily harm. That means they're treating what happened to my dad as intentional." "Yes." She looked at the transmission component on the bench. She looked at her hands. "He's been awake for 4 months," she said. "He's doing the physio. He can say about 30 words clearly." She pressed her lips together briefly. "He kept asking me if I was managing the shop okay. Every week, that's what he asked. Whether I was managing. I kept telling him yes. I didn't tell him what was happening because I didn't know if he could carry it." Calvin waited. "I have to tell him now," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." She stood up. She looked at the shovelhead on the bench and at the work spread around it. "I'll finish this first," she said. "I want to finish the job before I go." She was done in 2 hours. She packed her tools. Calvin drove her to the rehabilitation center where Gerald Baxter was doing his Thursday afternoon session, and he waited in the parking lot while she went inside. He sat in his truck in the January cold for an hour and 15 minutes. When Jorie came out, her eyes were red, but her face was settled, and she stood in the cold air for a moment before she got into the truck. He cried, she said. Her voice was rough at the edges, but even. I've never seen my dad cry. That's not how he is. She looked at the road ahead, but he kept nodding, like he'd already known somewhere that it hadn't just been bad luck, like part of him had been waiting to find out what he already half believed. Calvin said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and he understood that. He drove her back to the garage and she went back to work, because that was what she knew how to do when everything else was too large to hold with her hands. The trial took 8 months. It was not quiet and it was not simple, and there were weeks that were harder than any of them had predicted. A period in February when Devereaux's attorneys managed to delay proceedings in a way that stretched the uncertainty out past what felt fair, and a moment in April when a municipal official who had processed the planning application quietly resigned, and the story grew larger and more complicated before it grew cleaner. Jorie came to the Iron Pines garage through all of it. She did her work. She rebuilt engines and diagnosed problems and kept the club's paperwork running with the same systematic care she brought to everything she touched. In June, Calvin gave her a formal position, not contract work, a position with a rate and a title and a set of hours that were always exceeded because she arrived before anyone else and left after everyone. Tommy called her the best diagnostic ear in the region, which was a real thing to say, and he didn't say things he didn't mean. Lawrence Devereaux was convicted in September on 2 of the 3 charges. Reginald received a separate conviction on the obstruction count. The planning application fraud resulted in an additional civil judgment that stripped the Collier Street development proposal of any legal standing permanently. Baxter's garage remained on Collier and 2nd. It remained a garage. Gerald Baxter came to the Iron Pines Club on a Saturday morning in October, 8 days after sentencing. He walked with a cane and his speech was still slow in places, but he walked in through the bay door on his own and he shook Calvin's hand and said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who is choosing his words, precisely because they matter to him, "Thank you for keeping my daughter safe." Calvin looked at him. He looked at Jorie, who was standing 15 feet away with her arms at her sides, and her expression carefully neutral in the way she looked when she was proud of something and hadn't decided yet whether to show it. "She kept herself safe," Calvin said. "We just gave her somewhere solid to stand." Gerald Baxter nodded slowly. He looked around the garage, at the bikes on the lifts, at the fluorescent lights, at the men in leather moving through the space with the particular ease of people who have been somewhere long enough to know where everything is. Something passed between him and his daughter then, a father and a daughter, who had spent 8 months on opposite sides of a crisis, and who were now, for the first time since a Monday morning in spring, simply in the same room together. Later, after Gerald had gone and the garage had wound down to its end-of-day rhythms, Jorie sat on the step of the center bay with her coffee and Calvin came and stood nearby. Not too close, the way he stood when he had something to say and hadn't decided how to say it yet. She looked up at him. "I kept thinking," she said, "that if I could just document everything carefully enough, something would eventually have to happen. I didn't know who would care. I didn't know who would listen." She looked at her coffee. "I just kept writing things down because it was the only thing I could do that felt true." Calvin thought about a young woman walking into his garage in November with her own tool bag and a bruise on her right hand she hadn't explained, asking for work not out of desperation, but out of the particular discipline of a person who has decided that moving forward is the only direction available. The writing mattered, he said, but so did the walking in. She looked at him. "A lot of people have evidence," he said. "Not everyone has the nerve to carry it somewhere." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up, picked up her coffee, and looked at the shovel head in the corner bay that she'd been working on in stages for 3 weeks. "I want to finish that engine before the weekend," she said. He almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "go finish it." She went. He listened to the sounds of the garage settling into its evening, the clink of tools, the low conversation from the far side, the particular quiet of machines that have been properly cared for. And he thought about what it looked like when something broken got the time and the attention and the right pair of hands and was finally allowed to run the way it was supposed to run. He thought it looked exactly like this. Jorie Baxter stayed. She earned her certification the following spring and became the kind of mechanic other mechanics called when they couldn't figure something out, which is the highest category there is. She kept writing in her notebooks, not evidence anymore, just her life recorded in the same small, careful hand that had documented every wrong thing done to her father and that had, in the end, been the thing no one could take from her and no one could make disappear. She walked through the door of the Iron Pines garage every morning, and she set down her tools, and she started her day, and she never forgot what it meant that the door had been open when she needed it. Some things you find because you're looking. Some things you find because you walked in from the cold, carrying your own tools, and someone was paying enough attention to notice what you were carrying. Jorie Baxter walked in from the cold. The rest she built herself.